There are wrecking crews dismantling a mansion at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 77th Street on a cold February morning in 1927. The building has stood for 16 years. It cost $7 million to build, equivalent to roughly $200 million today. Inside are 121 rooms filled with marble from Italy, oak from Sherwood Forest, pieces of French chateau shipped across the Atlantic. A 15-foot wide fireplace carved from Numidian marble. 4 art galleries, a swimming pool, a private underground railroad for coal delivery. The crews will work for months, carting away the granite and steel and marble until nothing remains but an empty lot ready for the apartment building that will replace it. 14 years to build, 16 years standing. That is the complete life cycle of what was, at the time of its construction, the most expensive private residence in the United States. The mansion's crime was not architectural failure. The structure was sound. The crime was simpler and more damning. The man who built it had tried to buy his way into a society that refused to be bought. This is the story of William Andrews Clark, the son of immigrants who rose from a Pennsylvania log cabin to become one of America's richest men. He bribed his way into the United States Senate with documented cash payments preserved in the National Archives. He married his teenage ward in a ceremony that may never have occurred. He spent the equivalent of $200 million on a monument to his ambition and watched New York society reject every stone of it. The Metropolitan Museum of Art would refuse his art collection. The mansion would be demolished before the paint had properly aged. And his daughter would inherit his fortune, then disappear into a hospital room for 20 years, while her empty palaces sat waiting for an owner who would never return. Some buildings survive by becoming monuments. Others survive by being forgotten. Clark's mansion didn't survive at all. Before we dive into this twisted tale of corruption, social climbing, and spectacular failure, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you're fascinated by stories about Gilded Age excess, scandalous mansions, and the dark side of American wealth, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next journey into the monuments money built and society destroyed. Chapter 1. The Gold Coast. In the 1890s, Fifth Avenue from 59th Street to 96th Street was the most contested real estate in America. The stretch had been farmland 2 generations earlier. By the Gilded Age, it had become Millionaire's Row, an unbroken line of mansions where America's new fortunes competed for space and status. The avenue was called the Gold Coast. The nickname was both celebration and accusation. 2 groups fought for dominance. The Knickerbockers represented old money, descendants of the Dutch and English families who had settled Manhattan in the 17th and 18th centuries. They had made their fortunes in shipping and real estate, respectable trades that took generations to build. They lived in modest brownstones in Washington Square and conducted their social lives according to rules established before anyone west of the Hudson River mattered. The swells represented new money, fortunes made in a single generation through railroads, steel, oil, mining. They built mansions on Fifth Avenue designed to announce their arrival. The Knickerbockers made the announcements irrelevant by ignoring them. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor was the unquestioned leader of old New York society. She had married into the Astor real estate fortune and appointed herself arbiter of who belonged. Her ballroom at 355th Avenue and East 34th Street could hold 400 guests. This number became the definition of acceptable society. Ward McAllister, her distant relative and social secretary, coined the term, quote, zero, to describe the people who mattered. In February 1892, the New York Times published the official list. It included bankers, lawyers, brokers, real estate men, and railroad owners. It also included begrudgingly representatives of the nouveau riche that Mrs. Astor felt could no longer be excluded without making her appear out of touch. The Vanderbilt family, whose railroad fortune was barely 2 generations old, made the list. Inclusion came with conditions, however. You could be rich, you could be socially ambitious, you could not be both and expect immediate acceptance. The battle for Fifth Avenue reached its climax in March 1883 when Alva Vanderbilt threw a costume ball that changed the rules. Alva had married William Kissam Vanderbilt. grandson of the vulgar Commodore, whose behavior had kept the family out of society for decades. She commissioned Richard Morris Hunt to design a mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue that staggered New York with its size and grandeur. The house cost millions. The ball cost another $250,000, equivalent to roughly $6 million today. Alva invited 1,200 guests. Mrs. Astor was conspicuously absent from the list until she came calling at Alva's door, symbolically bowing to the new order as she sought an invitation for herself and her daughter. The message was clear. Money could force its way into society if deployed with sufficient ruthlessness and scale. The message was incomplete, however. Money worked for the Vanderbilts because Alva understood timing and strategy. She threw her ball at exactly the moment when younger members of old society were tired of their parents' restraint and eager for spectacle. She spent enough to make refusal seem petty. She demonstrated that new money could host events beyond the financial reach of old money. The key was not having wealth. The key was knowing how to use it. By 1897, Fifth Avenue had become a proving ground where American fortunes went to establish their legitimacy. The stakes were measured in millions and social calendar invitations. Andrew Carnegie would build the largest mansion on Fifth Avenue opposite Central Park. The Vanderbilt family would control an entire block between 51st and 52nd Streets. Dozens of industrial fortunes would commission architects to design palaces that announced their arrival. Into this carefully balanced ecosystem walked William Andrews Clark, carrying a fortune in copper and a United States Senate seat purchased with cash. He would build the most expensive mansion in American history. New York society would destroy him for it. Chapter 2. The Copper King. William Andrews Clark was born January 8, 1839, in a log cabin near Connellsville, Pennsylvania. His parents were Scottish and Irish immigrants who had come to America seeking land and opportunity. They found neither. When William was 17, the family moved to Iowa as homesteaders. The bright student briefly taught school, then enrolled at Iowa Wesleyan College to study law. He never practiced. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, Clark enlisted on the Confederate side. A contemporary wrote that there was _1_. The description would follow him for life. Around 1862, he deserted his regiment by means he never explained and headed west to the Colorado Territory to work the quartz mines. The gold never materialized. In 1863, Clark heard about the Montana gold rush and traveled north with his mining partners. They settled in Bannock, capital of the Montana Territory, and began placer mining. Clark's claim paid moderately. He earned perhaps $1,500. Most prospectors who struck small amounts of gold either spent it on drinking and gambling or invested it in another prospecting trip. Clark recognized opportunity elsewhere. The real money was in supplying the miners, not competing with them. He loaded a wagon with groceries in Salt Lake City and drove it north to the boomtowns of Montana. Everything sold immediately. The highest profits were on eggs. "I bought case after case," he said later. "I knew they would be frozen, but they were suitable for making Tom and Jerry's." The cold weather beverage was popular in Montana bars. He sold the eggs for $3 a dozen at a time when miners on Nevada's Comstock Lode, earning $4 a day, were called the highest-paid working men in America. Clark made similar killings on tobacco, mail contracts, and mercantile operations. By 1872, he had accumulated enough capital to become a banker in Deer Lodge, Montana. The business model was straightforward. He extended credit to miners using their mining claims as collateral. When they defaulted, he repossessed the properties. This placed him directly in the mining industry without the risk of prospecting. He enrolled in a crash course at the Columbia School of Mines in New York City to learn metallurgy, then returned to Montana to exploit his new expertise. The transformation of Butte from a declining gold camp into the richest copper mining district in the world created 3_4_: Marcus Daly, F. Augustus Heinze, and William Andrews Clark. Clark was the most successful. He owned the mines, the smelters that processed the ore, the banks that financed operations, the newspapers that shaped public opinion, the electric companies that powered the region, and the railroads that transported the copper. His business interests extended into timber, ranching, real estate, and the sugar beet industry in Southern California. He built a railroad from Salt Lake City to Los Angeles and sold lots along the route at a desert way station he named Las Vegas. He became, by most estimates, one of the two richest men in America. Only John D. Rockefeller's oil fortune exceeded Clark's copper wealth. When Clark died in 1925, his estate was valued at $200 to $300 million, equivalent to $3 to $4 billion in modern currency. He had achieved the classic American success story, log cabin to magnate in a single lifetime. His fortune was built on ruthlessness, opportunism, and an uncomplicated love of accumulating wealth. A historian later wrote that Clark, quote, he worked 20-hour days and treated business relationships as transactions to be optimized. He married Catherine Louise Stauffer in 1869 and fathered 7 children during a marriage that lasted until her death in 1893. His contemporaries described him as competent, driven, and utterly charmless. Mark Twain, who befriended Clark's rival Marcus Daly, wrote an essay in 1907 that captured how Eastern society viewed Western mining fortunes. "He is as rotten a human being as can be found anywhere under the flag," Twain wrote of Clark. "He is a shame to the American nation, and no one has helped to send him to the Senate who did not know that his proper place was the penitentiary, with a ball and chain on his legs. To my mind, he is the most disgusting creature that the Republic has produced since Tweed's time." By 1897, Clark had accumulated everything wealth could purchase, everything except the one thing that eluded him: respectability. For that, he would need to become a United States Senator. Chapter 3. The Senator Who Wasn't for Sale. At the time, U.S. senators were chosen not by voters, but by state legislatures. Clark understood this the way he understood everything, as a transaction. He had run unsuccessfully for the Senate in 1888, 1889, and 1893. Each loss was attributed to interference from Marcus Daly, whose Anaconda Copper Company controlled much of Montana's economy and political machinery. The rivalry between the two men had shaped Montana politics for a decade. Clark and Daly fought over the location of the state capital, the direction of the Democratic Party, and control of the copper industry. Both men owned newspapers that published vicious attacks on the other. Both men spent fortunes influencing elections. The competition escalated until it consumed Montana's political system entirely. In November 1898, legislative elections produced a Montana legislature nominally controlled by Democrats. The Democratic Party was fractured, however, between Daly Democrats and Clark Democrats. The January 1899 Senate election would depend on which faction could secure enough votes to prevail. Clark understood the mathematics. He needed 51 votes. The price per vote varied based on the legislator's current allegiances and future ambitions. The Montana legislature convened in January 1899 to select a senator. Balloting extended over 18 days. During that time, rumors of bribery circulated as freely as snowfall. One lawyer for the Daly camp wrote, "The purchase of votes was talked about almost as freely as the weather. The morning salutation of everyone was, 'What's the price of votes today?' The price escalated from a few $100s to $10,000, then to $30,000 for Senator Fred Whiteside's vote. Clark's agents distributed cash payments, promised employment, covered legal fees, and offered other favors. The exact amounts would be documented later by a Senate investigating committee. The total exceeded $400,000 to $31,000 in verified bribes, not counting another $200,000 offered but declined. In an era when a working family could live comfortably on $2,000 per year, Clark was spending legislators' lifetime earnings to purchase single votes. On January 28, 1899, the Montana legislature elected William Andrews Clark to the United States Senate by a vote of 54 to 40. Clark had gained 53 votes during the 3-week session. His opponents charged that such movement was possible only through massive bribery. They were correct. Clark presented his credentials to the Senate in December 1899. The Senate initially accepted them and immediately launched an investigation into the bribery allegations. The Privileges and Elections Committee spent months interviewing witnesses and reviewing financial records. In April 1900, the committee issued its finding. Clark was not entitled to his Senate seat. The evidence of bribery was overwhelming. Montana Attorney General Cornelius Nolan, a daily ally, had obtained bank records, copies of checks, and testimony from legislators who admitted accepting payments. The committee found that Clark had won his election through corruption so extensive that the result could not stand. Before the full Senate could vote on expulsion, Clark resigned on May 15, 1900. The resignation was part of an outrageous strategy. Clark's supporters lured Montana Governor Robert Smith out of the state on false pretenses involving a mining claim in San Francisco. With the governor absent, Lieutenant Governor Spriggs, a Clark ally, appointed Clark to fill the vacancy created by Clark's own resignation. The Senate refused to recognize the appointment. The ploy failed. Clark could afford to wait. In November 1900, Marcus Daly died. 2 months later, a new Montana legislature convened in Helena. Most of the winning candidates had received financial support from William Clark's political machine. In January 1901, this legislature elected Clark to the Senate for the term that would have begun 2 years earlier. This time, no formal charges of corruption were raised. Everyone understood that Clark had provided financial backing to legislative candidates. Everyone also understood that such support, while morally indistinguishable from outright bribery, fell within acceptable political practice if executed carefully. The Senate seated Clark without objection. He served a single term from 1901 to 1907. His legislative record was unremarkable. He introduced bills related to irrigation and land use in the West. He attended sessions regularly. He had no particular influence or distinction. In response to criticism about his bribery of the Montana legislature, Clark was widely reported to have said, "I never bought a man who wasn't for sale." The quote captured his philosophy perfectly. Every transaction had a price. Finding the price was simply a matter of investigation and persistence. Clark's bribery scandal became a case study in the dangers of indirect Senate elections. During debates over constitutional reform, reformers pointed to Montana in 1899 as evidence that state legislatures could be corrupted too easily. The scandal contributed directly to passage of the 17th Amendment in 1913, which mandated direct election of senators by popular vote. Clark had purchased a Senate seat. The reform he inadvertently prompted made such purchases impossible. The Senate seat was his. The respectability remained out of reach. Chapter 4. The Senator's Ward. While serving in Washington, Clark shocked the political world in 1904 by revealing he had a secret: a wife 39 years younger than himself. A child most people didn't know existed. Her name was Anna Eugenia La Chapelle. She was born March 10, 1878, in Michigan to French-Canadian immigrant parents. After her father's death, the family moved to Butte, Montana, where the teenage Anna came under Clark's guardianship. He was a widower. His first wife, Catherine Louise Stauffer, had died in 1893 after 24 years of marriage that produced 7 children. Clark, then in his 50s, took Anna La Chapelle into his household as a ward. Contemporary newspaper coverage emphasized that, quote, the timeline of what followed was deliberately obscured. Clark and Anna claimed they had married secretly in 1901 in Marseilles, France, in a ceremony performed by a Catholic priest. Clark was a lifelong Presbyterian and active Mason. No marriage record was ever found in France. Anna later signed an affidavit stating that quote, _11 their first child, Louise Amelia Andrée, was born August 13, 1902, in Spain. The timeline Clark claimed proved impossible to verify. If the marriage occurred in 1901 as stated, Clark forgot to mention it to his adult children, including his son, William Andrews Clark, Jr., whom he met in London shortly after the alleged ceremony. A man who had just married would presumably mention this fact to his son. Clark did not. In July 1904, while Clark served in the Senate, the Anaconda Standard newspaper broke the story. The headline thundered, quote 12. The revelation created a scandal. Clark was 65 years old. Anna was 26. He was a United States Senator. She had been his teenage dependent. The age difference was 39 years. Clark's newspaper, the Butte Miner, responded with damage control. An article published the day after the Anaconda Standard's revelation claimed the marriage, quote, 13. The article attempted to frame the relationship as a romantic inevitability. Quote, 14. Not everyone found the story convincing. Clark's first family was notably absent from celebrations. The secrecy surrounding the marriage date suggested that Anna had become pregnant before any ceremony occurred, necessitating a retroactive claim of earlier marriage to preserve respectability. The Catholic priest story was particularly suspicious given Clark's Presbyterian background and Masonic affiliations. Clark was not merely a copper magnate with a controversial marriage. He was a United States Senator with a controversial marriage revealed during his service in Washington. The scandal layered onto the bribery scandal that had forced his resignation 5 years earlier. Clark's reputation, already damaged by documented corruption, absorbed another blow. The man who had purchased a Senate seat had also acquired a bride young enough to be his granddaughter under circumstances that invited speculation about predation and impropriety. Anna gave birth to a second daughter, Huguette Marseilles, on June 9, 1906, in Paris. Clark was 67 years old when his youngest child was born. Observers noted that Clark seemed to love his second family with an intensity absent from his first marriage. He showered Anna and his daughters with attention, gifts, and affection. He commissioned portraits. He took them on extended European tours. The young family occupied his emotional life in ways that business and political ambition had previously dominated. Clark's relationship with Anna was not his only romantic entanglement during these years. Multiple women emerged claiming relationships or paternity. Actress Hattie Williams was reported to have received Clark's support during her early career. Several paternity lawsuits followed Clark through the courts. A historian later wrote, "The only thing he loved more than money, it was said, was women." Clark settled claims quietly when possible and ignored them when settlement seemed unnecessary. His wealth insulated him from consequences that would have destroyed men with smaller fortunes. With a Senate seat purchased and a teenage ward acquired as a wife, Clark turned his attention to the final prize, a place in New York society. He would build a monument no one could ignore. Chapter 5. Clark's Folly. In 1897, while still fighting his first Senate battle in Montana, Clark commissioned the New York firm of Lord, Hewlett, and Hull to build him a mansion at Fifth Avenue and 77th Street. The location was strategic. Fifth Avenue had become the address where American fortunes established their legitimacy. Clark wanted the largest, most expensive private residence Manhattan had ever seen. The initial plans were drafted by French architect Henri Deglane. The estimate came to $415,000. Clark reviewed the drawings and declared them insufficient. The mansion would need to be larger, much larger. He owned a European art collection that required proper gallery space. He intended the house to serve as both residence and museum. In 1901, Clark instructed Lord Hewlett and Hull to acquire additional land and revise the plans completely. The new estimate reached $2.5 million. Construction proceeded slowly. Legal disputes with neighbors delayed progress. The mansion's size violated unwritten conventions about appropriate scale. Obtaining materials took years. Clark bought a quarry in New Hampshire for $50,000, equivalent to roughly $1.7 million today, and built a railroad to transport stone from the quarry to New York. He acquired a bronze foundry with 200 workers to manufacture all metal fittings for the house. Marble came from Italy, oak came from Sherwood Forest in England. Pieces of dismantled French chateaux were shipped across the Atlantic and incorporated into the interior. Around 1904, Clark purchased the Salon Doré, an 18th-century gilded room from the Hôtel de Clermont in Paris, and had it installed in his mansion. The construction lasted nearly a decade and a half. The house rose 9 stories on a footprint measuring 250 feet on 77th Street and 77 feet on Fifth Avenue. Only Andrew Carnegie's mansion occupied more frontage on Fifth Avenue opposite Central Park. The completed structure contained 121 rooms, 31 bathrooms, 4 art galleries, a swimming pool, a concealed garage, 11 elevators, and a pipe organ with 4,000 pipes. Victorian Turkish baths occupied the basement. Laundry rooms filled the top floor. A private underground railway delivered coal for heating. The interiors exceeded the exterior in extravagance. The banquet room featured a Numidian marble fireplace 15 feet across with life-size figures of Diana and Neptune carved into the stone. The breakfast room contained 170 carved wooden panels. No two identical, vaulted corridors lined with Gustavino tile connected the main rooms. Greek marble columns supported ceilings decorated with medieval tapestries. A Gothic library housed Clark's collection of rare books. A conservatory maintained tropical plants. The Salon Doré occupied a place of honor with its gilded 18th-century French paneling and painted ceiling. The final cost reached $6 to $7 million, equivalent to approximately $200 million in modern currency. Accounting for inflation and comparing construction costs across eras remains imperfect. Yet by any measure, Clark had built the most expensive private residence in American history. He moved in around 1911 at age 72. By the time the final ornament was attached, the mansion was already out of style. The Beaux-Arts aesthetic had peaked and passed. French chateau-style architecture no longer impressed. The excessive ornamentation that Clark had specified to demonstrate his wealth now marked him as gauche. The extended construction period meant the house was designed in one era and completed in another. Architectural tastes had shifted. What seemed impressive in 1897 looked overwrought in 1911. Style, however, was the least of Clark's problems. The mansion had been designed to serve a specific purpose: to announce William Andrews Clark as a member of New York's social elite. Every room, every ornament, every imported piece of French chateau existed to prove that a Montana Copper King belonged on Fifth Avenue alongside the Vanderbilts and Astors and Carnegies. The house was not merely a residence, it was an argument made in marble and granite. New York society heard the argument. The response would be brutal. Chapter 6. Architectural Aberrations. Montgomery Schuyler, writing in Architectural Record, titled his column Architectural Aberrations. The house, he wrote, was an appropriate residence for the late P.T. Barnum. He felt the tower was meaningless and fatuous. The rounded rustication on the first floor suggested the prototype of a log house. At the time, the French style had gone out of fashion, and the ornamentation was no longer in vogue. Everything about Clark's mansion represented yesterday's taste executed at today's prices. The New York Times called it a, quote, 20 other critics were less kind. The four-sided tower with its three-story-high inward curving arch, topped by an open pergola, dominated the skyline. It was visible from almost anywhere in Central Park. This visibility was intentional. Clark wanted his mansion to be impossible to ignore. Critics agreed it was impossible to ignore. Though this was not the triumph Clark imagined, the tower announced the mansion the way a circus announces itself, loudly, garishly, and without subtlety. A contemporary satirical poem circulated in New York society. Quote 21. The poem continued for several verses, each mocking Clark's attempt to compensate for Western origins through Eastern architecture. The nickname Clark's Folly appeared in newspapers and society gossip almost immediately. The name stuck. Even publications that attempted neutral coverage could not avoid the phrase. The mansion became known not for its cost or size, rather for the spectacular failure it represented. The attacks went beyond aesthetics. Clark had built the mansion too late. Had he completed it in 1900, when Beaux-Arts excess still impressed, the response might have been different. Had he completed it before his Senate bribery scandal, social reception might have been warmer. Clark finished his mansion in 1911 as a 72-year-old man whose Senate career had ended in 1907 and whose bribery scandal remained fresh in memory. The house arrived after the moment when it might have mattered. Size itself became offensive. Old New York, money valued restraint. The Knickerbockers lived in brownstones that announced their status through location and lineage, not square footage. Even the Vanderbilts, who had crashed through social barriers with their 1883 costume ball, had exercised some judgment about scale. Clark's mansion dwarfed everything around it except Carnegie's residence. The comparison proved unfortunate. Andrew Carnegie had spent decades establishing himself as a philanthropist and public intellectual before building his mansion. Carnegie's cultural contributions earned him social acceptance before he ever commissioned an architect. Clark had no such foundation. He arrived with money, a bribery scandal, and a teenage ward he called his wife. The mansion announced all of this simultaneously. Clark's response to the criticism was silence. Or perhaps he said nothing because nothing had been recorded. No interviews, no public statements, no acknowledgement that the reviews bothered him. He had built the house he wanted at the price he was willing to pay. If New York society disliked it, New York society could look elsewhere. The problem transcended aesthetics or timing. The problem was that Clark built a house at all. New York had not invited him. The mansion was meant to force the invitation. Instead, it confirmed society's initial judgment. William Andrews Clark did not belong. Clark's monument had spoken. New York had heard the message and rejected it. Chapter 7. The Empty Ballroom. In all the years of William Andrews Clark's residence, his mansion hosted no balls, no society dinners, no gatherings that made the New York social calendar. The building had been constructed to announce his arrival. No one came. Clark moved in around 1911 with his wife Anna and daughters Andrée and Huguette. The family occupied a house designed for entertaining hundreds. The ballroom sat empty. The art galleries displayed masterpieces to an audience of servants. The 121 rooms echoed with absence. Staff estimated at over 20. Servants maintained the property. Yet their primary function was preserving a house that was not being used for its intended purpose. The absence of social activity was conspicuous. Other Fifth Avenue mansions appeared regularly in society columns. The Vanderbilts hosted benefits. The Astors held dinners. Even newly arrived fortunes could secure mention in the papers if they contributed to fashionable causes or attended the right events. Clark's name appeared in newspapers only in connection with his business dealings or political history. His Fifth Avenue mansion was mentioned in architecture journals as an example of excess. It never appeared in social columns as a venue for anything. Clark's daily life during his residence remains poorly documented. He was 72 years old when he moved in and 86 when he died. He traveled frequently between his properties in Montana, California, and Washington, D.C. He attended to business interests, though he had largely stepped back from active management. He spent time with his art collection, which had been central to the mansion's design. He doted on his young daughters. None of this involved the New York social world he had tried to enter. The daughters grew up in isolation from society. Andrée, born in 1902, died in 1919 at age 16 from meningitis. The death occurred at the family's vacation property in Maine, not at the Fifth Avenue mansion. Huguette, born in 1906, would later describe her childhood as lonely, despite the mansion's size. The family occupied a small fraction of the available space. Rooms remained unused. Galleries stood empty, except when Clark walked through them alone. The comparison to other social climbing success stories made Clark's failure more obvious. Alva Vanderbilt had forced her way into society through strategic excess and careful timing. She understood that new money needed old money's approval and structured her assault accordingly. Clark had money without strategy beyond spending. He built the largest house assuming size would compel attention. New York society demonstrated that attention and acceptance were not the same thing. The social calendar absence told the story clearly. Mrs. Astor's successors, Mamie Fish, Teresa Fair Ulrichs, and Alva Belmont, controlled New York society in the early 20th century. None invited Clark to their events. None attended events at his mansion because he hosted none. The machinery of social acceptance never engaged. Clark existed in New York as a wealthy man who happened to own a mansion, not as a member of the society that mattered. Money could buy servants. It could buy marble and bronze and pieces of French chateau. It could buy art by Delacroix and Degas. It could not buy guests. It could not buy acceptance. It could not purchase the thing Clark wanted most, a place at tables where his presence would confirm that a Montana Copper King belonged in New York. On March 2, 1925, William Andrews Clark died inside his monument to rejected ambition. He was 86 years old, having spent his final years in a house built to impress people who never cared. His wife and daughter did not stay for the funeral flowers to wilt. Chapter 8. Fled Anna Clark and her daughter Huguette moved out before the estate was settled. They rented a full-floor apartment at 907 Fifth Avenue for $30,000 per year, equivalent to approximately $450,000 in modern currency. The apartment contained 42 rooms. This was more space than most families would ever occupy. It was a fraction of the 121 rooms Clark's mansion offered. The decision to rent rather than own spoke clearly. Anna could have lived in the mansion for free. She inherited a fortune estimated at $200 to $300 million, equivalent to $3 to $4 billion today. Maintaining the Fifth Avenue mansion would have cost money, yet represented a small fraction of the estate. Anna and Huguette chose to pay rent elsewhere, rather than remain in the house Clark had built. The abandonment was immediate and complete. They took personal belongings and left. No attempt was made to preserve the mansion as a family home. No sentimental attachment delayed their departure. The mansion had failed to impress New York society. It had also failed to impress Clark's own family. They wanted nothing to do with it. The estate put the mansion on market immediately. Few bidders emerged. The problem was structural and economic. By 1927, Gilded Age mansions along Fifth Avenue were being demolished at an accelerating rate. The 1916 zoning resolution had permitted taller residential buildings, making apartment cooperatives more profitable than single-family homes. A mansion that cost $7 million to build in 1911 now represented an encumbrance. The quote 23, as one contemporary account described it, would be expensive to demolish and cart away. The Clark mansion was deemed especially burdensome to dismantle given its size and the quality of materials Clark had specified. Most of the mansion's value resided in the land. The building itself had negative worth. A buyer would need to pay for demolition before extracting value from the lot. This inverted typical real estate economics. Usually buildings add value to land. Clark's mansion subtracted value because removing it would cost more than it contributed. The mansion sat empty for months. Servants maintained it minimally. Dust accumulated in unused rooms. The art collection had been bequeathed elsewhere and would be removed. The Salon Doré would be donated to the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington. The furniture would be dispersed. Everything that made the mansion Clark's would be stripped away, leaving only the shell he had spent years and millions creating. The failure was complete. Clark had built a monument to permanence. His family fled within weeks of his death. The building that was meant to establish his legacy instead demonstrated how thoroughly New York society had rejected him. No one wanted to live in Clark's mansion. The market confirmed what social calendars had already established. William Andrews Clark did not matter to New York. The family had fled. The mansion sat empty. One judgment remained. Would New York's greatest museum accept what its greatest families had rejected? Chapter 9. The Metropolitan says, no William Andrews Clark's will contained a provision that must have seemed reasonable to a man accustomed to buying whatever he wanted. He would donate his art collection to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In return, the museum would display it permanently in galleries bearing his name. The collection was valued at $3 million, equivalent to approximately $44 million today. It contained more than 800 objects. Paintings by Eugène Delacroix, Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot, Thomas Gainsborough, Edgar Degas and Auguste Rodin, sculptures, tapestries, rugs, Greek terracottas, antique lace, Indo-European rugs, Italian Renaissance maiolica, stained glass windows, and the Salon Doré, the 18th century gilded French room Clark had purchased and installed in his mansion. The collection represented decades of acquisition and reflected Clark's determination to surround himself with objects that signified culture and refinement. The condition seemed simple. The Metropolitan Museum would house the collection in well-lighted gallery or galleries for the exclusive occupancy of these works of art, to be designated the William A. Clark Collection. Clark wanted his name attached permanently to his donations. He wanted immortality through association with America's premier art institution. The museum could have the art. Clark would have the recognition. The Metropolitan Museum of Art declined the bequest. The stated reason was that the museum could not commit to fulfilling the conditional terms. _25_ museums needed flexibility. in how they displayed collections, binding the institution to permanent exhibition of a single donor's collection in dedicated galleries violated principles of curatorial independence. The condition was unreasonable given how museums operated. The stated reason concealed a deeper truth. The Metropolitan Museum did not want permanent association with William Andrews Clark. His reputation was damaged beyond repair. The Senate bribery scandal defined him. The marriage to his teenage ward reinforced impressions of impropriety. The architectural disaster of his Fifth Avenue mansion demonstrated poor judgment and worse taste. Clark's name carried no social value. Accepting his collection meant accepting his name attached to it forever. The museum's trustees decided the art was not worth the association. This was the final social judgment. Mrs. Astor's 400 had ignored him. Architectural critics had mocked him. Society had refused to attend events at his mansion. Now the Metropolitan Museum refused to accept his art collection on the terms that would have given him the recognition he craved. There would be no Clark wing at the Metropolitan Museum. There would be no permanent galleries bearing his name in New York's most important cultural institution. The rejection was absolute. The Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. accepted the collection with enthusiasm. The Corcoran was a smaller, less prestigious institution, eager for the kind of European art that rarely came to Washington. The trustees agreed to Clark's conditions without hesitation. They would build a new wing designed by architect Charles Platt specifically to house the collection. The Clark wing would open in 1928, 3 years after his death. The collection would remain at the Corcoran until the gallery's financial collapse in 2014, when the artwork was distributed to the National Gallery of Art and other institutions. The irony was perfect. The museum that rejected him would outlive him by a century, and counting. The museum that accepted him would fail. Even in death, Clark could not achieve the permanence he purchased. The Metropolitan Museum's rejection settled a question Clark had spent decades and millions trying to answer. In New York, some money simply did not spend. Some reputations could not be rehabilitated. Some men, no matter how rich, did not belong. Clark had tested these boundaries with $7 million in construction costs and $3 million in donated art. He had lost both times. With the art collection refused and the family gone, only the building remained. In 1927, it met the fate Clark had feared most, not preservation, but erasure. Chapter 10. 16 years. 14 years to build. 14 years occupied. In February 1927, the mansion sold for under $3 million, less than half its construction cost. By year's end, it was rubble. The buyer was Anthony Campagna, a real estate developer who understood that the mansion's value resided entirely in the land it occupied. The building itself represented negative worth. Campagna would need to spend months and substantial money demolishing the structure before he could extract value from the Fifth Avenue lot. The economics made sense. However, the 1916 zoning resolution had made tall apartment buildings profitable. A 12-story cooperative could house dozens of wealthy families on the same footprint where Clark's mansion had housed one. Campagna purchased the right to destroy what Clark had built. The sale price confirmed what the market already knew. The land was valuable. The mansion was not. Of the $3 million Campagna paid, the majority was attributed to location. The mansion itself had no value and imposed costs. This inverted typical real estate economics, where buildings add worth to land. Clark had built so extravagantly, used such expensive materials, and created such a monstrosity of scale that removing it would be more expensive than leaving most buildings standing. The granite, marble, and steel that Clark had imported from New Hampshire, Italy, and England would need to be demolished and carted away at considerable expense. The demolition began immediately after the sale. Wrecking crews worked for months. They salvaged what they could. The Salon Doré was carefully removed and shipped to the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington. Other architectural elements were sold to dealers in antique building materials. Most of the mansion was simply destroyed. The granite was broken into pieces small enough to haul away. The marble was shattered. The steel framework was cut apart. The 121 rooms, the 31 bathrooms, the 4 art galleries, the swimming pool, the underground coal railway, The 11 elevators, the pipe organ with 4,000 pipes, all of it reduced to rubble and removed. By the end of 1927, nothing remained. The lot sat empty, prepared for the next phase of its existence. Rosario Candela, the architect who would define luxury apartment design in New York, designed a 12-story cooperative for the site. The building would be called 960 Fifth Avenue. The New York Times described it as literally 12 mansions built one on top another. Apartments were pre-sold for prices reaching $350,000, equivalent to over $5 million today. The building was completed in 1928 and still stands. The mathematics of Clark's failure were stark. Nearly 15 years to build at a cost of $7 million. Roughly the same period of occupancy during which the mansion failed to achieve its social purpose. 2 years of abandonment while the estate tried to find a buyer. Sale for under $3 million, less than half the construction cost. Immediate demolition. Total time standing. Approximately 18 years from completion to erasure. Clark had built the most expensive private residence in American history. It was one of the shortest-lived major mansions in New York. Buildings usually survive by becoming too important to demolish or too expensive to replace. Clark's mansion was neither. It survived just long enough to witness his social rejection, then disappeared. The apartment building that replaced it still stands today at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 77th Street. There is no plaque marking what was there before. No indication that the most expensive mansion in America once occupied the site. The erasure was complete. Clark had feared obscurity. He built a monument to prevent it. The monument lasted less than 2 decades before being erased entirely. Yet the story of Clark's mansion had one more chapter to write, one that would unfold in hospital rooms and empty estates for nearly a century after the wrecking crews finished. Chapter 11. The Daughter Who Disappeared. Huguette Clark inherited $300 million, 3 palatial estates, and a fortune in art. She spent the last 20 years of her life in a hospital room measuring 12 by 15 feet. She was born June 9, 1906, in Paris while her father was serving in the United States Senate. William was 67. Anna was 28. Huguette grew up in the Fifth Avenue mansion during her father's final years. Her sister Andrée, 4 years older, was her closest companion. The girls were sheltered from New York society by parents who had been rejected by that society. They received private tutoring, learned multiple languages, studied art and music. Their childhood was materially privileged, yet socially isolated. In 1919, Andrée fell ill with meningitis during a family vacation in Maine. She died August 6th, 1 week before her 17th birthday. The loss devastated Huguette. She was 13 years old. Her sister, the person she had been closest to, was gone. The family returned to New York, diminished. 6 years later, William Andrews Clark died in his Fifth Avenue mansion. Anna and Huguette immediately moved to the apartment at 907 Fifth Avenue. Huguette was 19 years old, an heiress to one of America's great fortunes and eligible in the eyes of society, looking for wealthy marriage prospects. She made her debut in 1926, 1 year after her father's death. Newspapers published photographs of her at social events. She appeared in society columns as one of America's most eligible young women. In 1928, she married William Gower, son of a business associate of her father. The marriage lasted less than 1 year. In 1930, Huguette traveled to Reno, Nevada, to obtain a quick, uncontested divorce. A photograph taken the day her divorce became final would be the last image of her ever made public. She was 24 years old. She reclaimed her maiden name and insisted on being called Mrs. Clark, despite never remarrying. The withdrawal was gradual yet complete. Through the 1930s, Huguette attended fewer social events. She spent more time alone in the apartment at 907 Fifth Avenue. She painted. She collected dolls, not children's toys, rather elaborate, expensive, museum-quality French and Japanese dolls. She maintained correspondence with a small circle of friends while avoiding public appearances. When her mother Anna died in 1963, Huguette's isolation deepened. She was 57 years old and alone. Huguette owned 3 properties she never visited. The apartment at 907 Fifth Avenue eventually expanded to occupy 3 combined floors, totaling 42 rooms. She lived in a small portion of this space. The Bellosguardo estate in Santa Barbara, California, sat on 23 acres overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The mansion was maintained in pristine condition at a cost of $40,000 per month. Huguette had not visited since the 1950s. Le Beau Chateau in New Canaan, Connecticut, occupied 52 acres that Huguette purchased in 1952. She never set foot on the property. The estates were maintained, staffed, and ready for an owner who would never arrive. In 1991, at age 84, Huguette was admitted to Doctors Hospital on the Upper East Side for treatment of skin cancer. The lesions were operable. Doctors expected her to recover and return home. Huguette refused to leave the hospital. She was frail, nearly blind, and increasingly fearful of the outside world. The hospital room felt safer than the apartment she owned. She remained. For the next 20 years, Huguette Clark lived in hospitals. She moved from Doctors Hospital to Beth Israel Medical Center when the former closed. Her hospital costs started at $800 to $29 per day and eventually rose to $1,200 daily. She could easily afford it. Her fortune generated more income than she could spend even while living in a hospital room. Her nurse, Hadassah Perry, became her primary companion. Perry worked 12 hours per day, 7 days per week for many years. Huguette showered her with gifts totaling $31 million over 2 decades. The gifts included cash, artwork, and real estate. Huguette's attorney Wallace Bach and accountant Irving Kamsler managed her finances and became executors of her estate. Both would receive bequests in her will. Huguette remained mentally sharp until the end of her life, according to multiple witnesses, including doctors who had no financial interest in her estate. She was competent, articulate, and capable of managing her affairs. She chose to live in a hospital room. She chose to give away millions to her nurse. She chose to maintain empty estates she would never visit. The choices were unusual, yet legally sound. At age 98, Huguette signed 2 wills 6 weeks apart. The first will left her estate to distant relatives from her father's first marriage. Most of these relatives had never met her. The last time any of them had seen her was in 1957. The second will canceled the first. It left the bulk of her estate to the Bellosguardo Foundation, a charity she created to turn her Santa Barbara estate into an arts center. The nurse, goddaughter, personal assistant, and others received substantial bequests. The relatives received nothing. Huguette Clark died May 24, 2011, at age 104, 2 weeks before her 105th birthday. She died in Beth Israel Medical Center surrounded by nurses. Her 3 mansions sat empty, maintained yet unlived in, waiting for an owner who had stopped coming decades earlier. The relatives challenged the will. They argued Huguette was mentally ill, incompetent, and manipulated by her nurse and advisors. A criminal investigation was launched. Depositions were taken. The case consumed 2 years and millions in legal fees. In September 2013, on the eve of trial, the parties reached a settlement. The relatives received $34.5 million. The Bellosguardo Foundation received the Santa Barbara estate and funding to operate it. The nurse agreed to return $5 million to the estate and gave up rights to millions more. The attorney and accountant relinquished their bequests and roles as executors. No criminal charges were filed. The daughter inherited her father's fortune and vanished. She owned mansions she never visited. She lived in a hospital room by choice. She gave away millions to caregivers. She died alone in a space that measured 12 by 15 feet while maintaining 3 empty palaces. The father built a monument to announce his importance. The daughter inherited his wealth and disappeared into rooms no larger than servants' quarters. Both stories ask the same question: what survives when the money stops? Chapter 12. What remains? From 121 rooms and $7 million in construction, 4 things survived: a French room, a photograph collection, some paintings scattered across museums, and an address that no longer describes what stands there. The Salon Doré. The 18th century gilded room that Clark purchased around 1904 and installed in his mansion was carefully preserved during the 1927 demolition. it was shipped to the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., where it became part of the Clark Wing that opened in 1928. The room survived the Corcoran's financial collapse in 2014. Today it is managed by the National Gallery of Art and remains on display in the original Corcoran building, now part of George Washington University. Visitors can see the gilded paneling and painted ceiling that once adorned Clark's mansion. The room outlived the building that housed it. The art collection Clark assembled and bequeathed to the Corcoran contained approximately 800 objects. The Metropolitan Museum had refused them. The Corcoran accepted them and built a wing to display them. For 86 years, the collection remained largely intact in Washington. When the Corcoran dissolved in 2014, the National Gallery of Art received the largest portion. Other works were distributed to institutions throughout the Washington area. In 2018, 9 works were sent to the Montana Museum of Art and Culture, returning pieces of Clark's collection to the state where he made his fortune. The art survived, scattered across museums that never knew William Andrews Clark except through the labels on paintings he once owned. The photographs survived in archives. The Museum of the City of New York holds extensive documentation of the mansion. The Wirtz Brothers photography firm, which specialized in architectural documentation, photographed the building multiple times between its completion and demolition. These images show the mansion in its brief glory, the tower dominating the skyline, the elaborate facade, the Fifth Avenue frontage. The photographs are the primary evidence that the mansion existed at all. Without them, Clark's Folly would exist only in written descriptions and legal records. The address remains: 960 Fifth Avenue, corner of 77th Street. A 12-story cooperative apartment building designed by Rosario Candela occupies the lot where Clark's mansion stood. There is no plaque, no marker, no indication that anything historically significant once occupied the site. Residents of the building likely do not know that the most expensive private home in American history stood where their building stands. The erasure is complete. Huguette's properties met different fates. The apartment at 907 Fifth Avenue was sold after her death, the proceeds distributed according to the settlement agreement. Le Beau Chateau in Connecticut was sold. Bellasguardo in Santa Barbara eventually became the headquarters of the Bellasguardo Foundation, as Huguette's will intended, though establishing the foundation took years of legal maneuvering. The Copper King Mansion in Butte, Montana, which Clark built in the 1880s and left to his son Charles, survives today as a bed and breakfast and museum. Tourists can visit the 34 rooms and see how Clark lived before he attempted to conquer New York. The mansion he built in Montana survived. The mansion he built in New York did not. The Salon Doré survives in Washington. The photographs survive in archives. The art survives in museums. The mansion exists only in memory and books about a daughter who lived in hospitals while owning empty palaces. William Andrews Clark's Fifth Avenue mansion tells a story about American ambition, corruption, and the limits of what money can buy. Clark embodied the Gilded Age dream in its most ruthless form. He rose from a Pennsylvania log cabin to challenge John D. Rockefeller as the richest man in America. He accomplished this through shrewd investments, brutal business practices, and an uncomplicated love of accumulating wealth. The copper he extracted from Montana's mines carried electricity to the world. The railroads he built opened the West to development. The city he founded, Las Vegas, would become one of America's most recognizable destinations. His accomplishments were substantial. Accomplishment alone could not buy belonging, however. New York society in the Gilded Age operated on principles that predated industrial fortunes. The Knickerbockers who controlled social access valued lineage, education, and restraint. They accepted new money when it demonstrated appropriate humility and spent several generations proving itself worthy. Clark had money without patience for the initiation process. He tried to buy his way in immediately through architectural excess. The strategy failed completely. The mansion stood as evidence of several uncomfortable truths. Money could buy senators, yet not respectability. Wealth could command servants, yet not social equals. A man could own the most expensive house in America and find that no one wanted to visit. The very mechanisms that made Clark rich, ruthlessness, corruption, disregard for social convention, were exactly what made him unacceptable to the society he wanted to join. The Senate bribery scandal contributed to passage of the 17th Amendment, which mandated direct election of senators and made Clark's particular corruption impossible to repeat. This is perhaps his most lasting legacy, being so corrupt that he helped reform the system that enabled his corruption. The irony would have escaped him. Clark never demonstrated capacity for self-reflection or concern about how others viewed his methods. His daughter Huguette inherited his fortune, yet rejected everything it represented. She lived in hospital rooms while maintaining empty mansions. She collected dolls instead of hosting society. She gave away millions to caregivers while relatives she never met waited for her death. Her choices were strange yet comprehensible. She wanted nothing to do with the social world that had rejected her father. She disappeared into privacy the way her father had failed to appear in society. Today, visitors can see what remains. The Copper King Mansion in Butte operates as a bed and breakfast, offering tours during summer months. The Salon Doré can be viewed at the former Corcoran Gallery building in Washington, D.C., now part of the George Washington University campus. Pieces of Clark's art collection are displayed at the National Gallery of Art and the Montana Museum of Art and Culture. Photographs of the mansion are available in the Museum of the City of New York's archives. The address, 960 Fifth Avenue, corner of 77th Street, remains, though the building that stands there now has no connection to what preceded it. What does not remain is any sense that William Andrews Clark mattered to New York. He built a monument to permanence that lasted less than 2 decades. He donated art that was refused by the institution he hoped would preserve his name. He lived in a mansion that society never visited. He died in a house nobody wanted. The house died 2 years later. The mansion failed at everything it was designed to do. It did not gain him social acceptance. It did not preserve his reputation. It did not survive as architecture. Yet it succeeded in ways he never intended, as evidence. Evidence of how corruption worked in the Gilded Age. Evidence of what happened when new money crashed against old barriers. Evidence that some things truly cannot be bought, no matter how much money changes hands. The building is gone. The man is forgotten except as a cautionary tale. His daughter vanished into hospitals and memory. The story survives because it reveals something true, that wealth alone cannot command respect, that social barriers exist beyond money's reach, and that the monuments we build to announce our importance often announce our failure instead. William Andrews Clark's mansion stood at the corner of ambition and rejection for 16 years. Then it was torn down and forgotten. Some legacies are built on what survives, others are built on what doesn't. Clark's mansion survives as a story about erasure, the ultimate fate of a fortune spent trying to buy something that was never for sale.